Okay, so I think we're gonna have a pretty short class here this afternoon. Just a couple of things to talk about, and then we will save a little bit of time talking about the exam if you have any questions. If not, then we'll have a very short class. So let's talk a little bit about this payments article that you had to read from The Economist, right? The digital surge. I think this is directly relates to a lot of what we talked about this morning about the Fed's ability to control the money supply and how this is getting more complicated, right? And all of this has been completely jump-started by COVID, because COVID, I think many places have not wanted to take currency, right? Because currency can have germs on it, right? And so actually there have been some studies that kind of look at currency and how filthy it is. It is one of the most filthy things that you touch. In the US somewhat, but actually the Fed does a pretty good job of like rotating money in and out. But for those of you who've traveled abroad, you'll see many countries don't do such a good job of rotating their currency, and you can get some pretty disgusting bills and coins over time. And so, yeah, right, this coupled with the fact that it's dangerous to go to a bank, a lot of people are simply not leaving their house, has led to this big surge in payments, right? And so, while the US has kind of had this surge, it's very clear that the US is still far behind most other countries when it comes to digital payments, right? We've talked about China, for instance. China is well ahead of the US in terms of this movement to digital payments, including the company Ant, right, which you read about, ANT, which I believe now might be the most valuable company in the world, right? So that gives you an idea of how valuable these payment systems have become in China. And when we talk about the Chinese financial system next week, I'll give you a reading about Ant. But Ant is really kind of a spin-off of having a senior moment of Jack Ma's Corporation. Man, what can I think of it? Anyway, kind of, anyway, well, we'll talk about it later. It'll come to me in a moment. But so, this is one of the most valuable companies in the world now. And it is essentially, well, it's a little bit more than a payment system, right? And I think that's one of the things that we're going to talk about here in a second, is that there's payment systems and then there's financial systems, right? In the US right now, we basically have payment systems, digital payment systems like Venmo or PayPal, but are you really paying for anything with Venmo or PayPal? You're not really paying for anything, right? Because Venmo and PayPal are linked to a credit card or a bank account. So these things are simply payment systems, but they're not really paying for anything, right? You're still relying on the fundamental infrastructure of banks to provide the finance, right? And so that's kind of the system that we have right now. Your book calls this kind of stage one, right? Well, actually, we're kind of moving into, I think in the US, we're still basically in stage one, which is where banks do the finance and the payments, right? But we are moving to stage two, and COVID has greatly pushed us forward in this, in which banks do the finance and apps do the payment. By apps, I mean things like PayPal and Venmo, right? And so these PayPal and Venmo are still relatively small, but I mean, I think you can see the day when they will take over the majority of the payments, or apps like it will take over the majority of the payments. Stage 3 is really more where China is, right? Where the apps do the payment in finance of the payments. But banks really kind of do everything else. Right? So this is really where China is to some extent. With Ant. Ant, the company I was thinking of, it's Alipay. Well, it's, or Alibaba, right? Alibaba, to give you some idea, Alibaba is kind of like Amazon, right? It's something between Amazon and eBay, but then it's also evolved a lot of the services that Facebook provides. And so you can kind of imagine if you put Amazon and Facebook together, you'd have a big company, right? And so Ant is really the spin-off of Alipay. Alipay was really kind of a financial payment system that was associated with Alibaba. So it'd be somewhat like if Amazon had its own payment system. And so Ant, though, now has really kind of developed to serve a lot of the functions of banks, including providing its own finance for its payments. But for everything else, right, everything that are not actually related to payments, right? Like, so if you're starting a company and you need capital, you still have to go to a bank, right? So it's not like we have, like banks have no purpose in China, right? They still do. They still do a lot of the lending. But when it comes to kind of consumer finance, in terms of consumer finance and payments, that's largely done on apps now and will probably continue to become even more that way. The question is, and I think this is probably unlikely, is whether countries get to stage 4, when you only have apps, that we don't really rely on banks to do any of the finance. So if you need a mortgage, you go online. If you want to buy a car, you do nothing but go online and you get a loan from PayPal or Venmo, right? Who is actually providing the lending itself, not relying on somebody else to provide the lending. That's probably unlikely, and for many reasons. One of them is because I'm not sure that governments want it to be that way, right? Because when you move to a world of online, what does this mean about regulation? Right? How are governments going to regulate these kind of things? It becomes a lot more difficult. And then, there's just questions about what does monetary policy look like? In this world where only banks provide finance. What about transparency? One of the things about regulation is that banks have to provide meaningful information to the public. Are apps going to have to do the same thing, right? Bitcoin doesn't file regular financial statements, right? I mean, it's a lot of what goes on with Bitcoin is a bit of a mystery. And so, do we want a financial system in which so much of it is unforeseen? And then, as many of you noted in your writings, then there's also this kind of rush to be, because I think a lot of people believe that these are winner-take-all markets. And by winner-take-all means they're really going to boil down to one firm does 90% of the business, and then there's going to be some little firms out there, right? So everybody kind of wants to jump in to be the big thing, right? Whether it's going to be PayPal or Venmo, or Facebook and Google want to get in on these things too, right? So they're developing their own alternatives to develop payment systems. In China, just like everything else in the Chinese financial system, it really is boiled down to winner take all, right? That Ant now is doing a huge proportion of payments in China, just like the 4 big Chinese banks do a huge proportion of the finance in China. So anyway, within this whole thing of surge, there's a question about how does this impact monetary policy? And you know, I have to say right now, the answer would be who knows? Early in the block, we talked about digital money, right? We talked about central banks moving to a world of providing only digital currency. That's something that some central banks have looked into more than the Fed. The Fed has been very cautious, but with this movement toward digital payments, it probably has also got the Fed thinking more about moving to truly digital money, right? And I think that's really an interesting question. What does being a lender of last resort mean in this world where you have so much shadow banking, what we would call shadow banking, right? Non-traditional banks doing banking-like activities. There's a lot of hidden risks to this shadow banking that I'm not sure that the Fed is ever going to completely understand, or certainly not understand in real time. And then there's just the simple mechanics of monetary policy. And by this, I mean, what's happening to the money multiplier? What's happening to interest rates? Can the Fed control these things like they used to? I know that this is one of the things that the Fed really worries about, is that all of this complicated financial innovation has the potential to lead to a loss of control over monetary policy that the Fed has right now. So one way you can kind of see this is, look at what's happening. Look at the behavior of M1 and M2 here. Okay, so this is a good graph that kind of illustrates both how good the Fed is okay. This kind of illustrates how good the Fed is, but the challenges that it faces as well. Let me, you can kind of see this, right? Okay. There. So this is looking at M1. First off, one of the things you'll notice here is that M1 has been very smooth, right? I mean, the Fed does a really good job of pulling the dog back, to use my analogy, right? So yeah, if you look at day to day, you'll see wild fluctuations, but over the long run, the Fed does a pretty good job. You know, and It looks like the pace of money growth has gone up, but it really hasn't. This is just a function of exponential growth, right? That you're always going to get this kind of loop up at the end, right? Because bigger numbers lead to compounding. But this is really pretty steady growth. The Fed has been able to maintain a really pretty steady growth rate of M1. However, you'll notice here, what has the Fed done during the COVID crisis? Big jump in M1, right? So this is the Fed trying to protect liquidity in the ways that we've talked about. The Fed has been extremely aggressive in trying to increase liquidity because they feel like that's been drying up here, right? That's been, so the size of this jump is really significant. To some extent, this is overblown because it's the most recent data, right? So if we had 20 years after this, some of this would be dampened. But it does give you some sense that this has really been, you know, I won't say unprecedented, but quite dramatic. Okay, so that's M1. Now look at the monetary base. I can got this pulled up here. Right. This is even more surprising. First off, notice how volatile the monetary base has been. What does that tell you? If M1 for most of this period has been smooth, but the monetary base has been all over the place, what must be explaining that? Well, what is M1? Why do we think if this has been relatively smooth, why has the Fed been keeping monetary base so volatile? The multiplier has been volatile, right? If this is all over the place, if it's up and down, what does the Fed have to do to keep this steady? It's got to move this up and down a lot, right? So the volatility in the monetary base here really tells you that the money multiplier is all over the place, right? So in other words, the dog is all over the place and the Fed has to keep on yanking it back more and more. So we see a lot of volatility here, and almost certainly what's all that volatility from? A lot of things, but financial innovation is one of them, right? Some of it is risk, right? Particularly the big jump here and the big jump here related to COVID. But then in the middle, it's just financial innovation, right? That the ways that we pay things, the ways that we conduct finance are changing, and this changes the money multiplier and forces the Fed to constantly be changing what it's doing with the monetary base. If you look here at the change in the monetary base, though, the change in the monetary base is roughly proportionate to the change in M1. So what does that mean? That despite everything that's going on, it doesn't really look yet like the money multipliers changed very much because of COVID. How are we to understand that? I don't know, honestly. Will it stay that way? I don't know, right? I mean, there's so much uncertainty here related to how payment systems are going to change in the future that certainly this is something the Fed's paying a lot of attention to, right? So, you know, here we just don't have clear answers, right? We know that the Fed is on this. The Fed is good at this, but yet, you know, just the fact that monetary base is so volatile tells us a lot about how volatile and how volatile the money multiplier is. And that in turn tells us that there's a lot of things going on in our financial system that the Fed's just trying to react to, right? So, yeah, right. So to me, looking at this data, there's no obvious reason to think that the multiplier has changed a lot. But once again, the multiplier has been kind of flopping around a lot the last 10 years. So, you know, who knows what could happen in the next few months, right? And certainly, if the longer the crisis lasts, as we've talked about, the more it puts the banking system in danger, right? And if the banking system gets in danger, you're certainly going to see changes in the money multiplier, right? Certainly, you're going to see that. So anyway, that's just kind of I would say, a little recap of what's going on with monetary policy today, right? So you think the Fed's job is tough. Well, it is tough. But to some extent, the Fed's job is only getting tougher, but it's not as tough as the job that many central banks have, right? In some sense, all this uncertainty is just making the Fed's job more like other central banks, right? Who face a great deal of uncertainty when it comes to running monetary policy. And so this is the reading that I gave you about central banking in sub-Saharan Africa. So I just wrote a little bit about this. So I lived in Botswana, Africa for a year. And while I was in Botswana, I spent a little bit of time at the Bank of Botswana, which is the central bank of Botswana. So I don't know if any of you know Botswana. Here's my bad picture of Africa. It's not very good. But here's South Africa, right? And here's Botswana, right? So Botswana is a landlocked country about the size of Texas, but it has the population of Iowa. So it's pretty sparsely populated, right? Pretty sparsely populated. All of you have seen Botswana, you just don't know it. Botswana is where the Kalahari Desert is, and so if you watched National Geographic and you've seen cheetahs and lions and elephants and all that, a lot of that stuff is filmed in Africa. It's kind of like a zoo, right? When I lived there, we had monkeys in the backyard, and we waited for, we had traffic jams while elephants crossed the road and all that kind of fun stuff. So it's a beautiful country, interesting place, but it's got some real problems, right? Well, I mean, actually, relative to Africa, the rest of Africa, Botswana is a relatively rich country, and it's a relatively stable country. So in that sense, it's in good shape. But it has many of the problems that less developed countries have, right? So less developed countries have a lot of problems when it comes to central banking. And so let's just kind of talk about some of these problems. And you can kind of think about how this makes monetary policy extremely complicated, right? Extremely complicated. Of course, one of the big challenges is that most of these countries have weak financial systems. And most of these countries have very weak financial systems. They have no bond markets. How's that a problem for monetary policy? I mean, in the US, how does monetary policy work typically? What's the primary tool? Right, buying and selling government bonds. What do you do in a country that doesn't really have many government bonds? It's not clear, right? It's not clear. It's not exactly clear how you go about conducting open market operations. Some countries might have a bond market that you can get involved in buying, but other countries, you got to figure out some other way. Because of these weak financial systems, often there's just not a lot of finance going on. And if there's not a lot of finance, that means you're not getting a very big money multiplier, because people just don't lend out money. Not a lot, right? Not a lot. in most countries, you have a small number of relatively big banks. And so you have the problem of essentially monopoly. And monopoly in many countries really means government influence. So without getting into the details of it, I will say that when I was in Botswana, it was amazing how much time people at the central bank thought about what they could ask banks to do and what they could not ask banks to do. And a lot of times what they could not ask banks to do was basically because they were afraid of the banks. They were afraid of the political power that the banks had, right? Because there's, just a small number of banks did most of the finance, right, in the entire country. So these things all create a very difficult system. I mean, in many of these countries, it's just really hard to know how you do run monetary policy, right? How exactly you do run monetary policy. Botswana was lucky enough that they did have some government bond market, but it was very small, right? It was very small. It wasn't very liquid. And so, once again, conducting open market operations, it wasn't the kind of smooth, quick, cheap process that it is in the United States. It was always kind of fraught with a lot of difficulties. Some countries have the problem of dollarization. I think we've talked about this before. What is dollarization? We talked about this. Dollarization is basically when a foreign currency is used domestically. Okay, when a foreign currency is used domestically. Sometimes this is unofficial, such as Zimbabwe, right? So Zimbabwe, same time I was living in Botswana, I erased my map, but Zimbabwe is the next door neighbor to Botswana. And so when I was there in 2009, Zimbabwe had a 100% a day inflation rate. 100% a day. So it cost $50 billion to ride the bus. And the next day, it would cost $100 billion to ride the bus. Okay? So that it really translates to about, well, what is it? I think it was 1 to the 10th power and 13 zeros% inflation every year, right? It's a number you can't really comprehend, right? I mean, it was just astonishing what was happening in Zimbabwe. And so you can guess, would anybody use Zimbabwe currency to pay their bill? No, of course not, right? Of course not. And so what did people do? They either bartered or they used American dollars, right? So they had essentially dollarized. To the extent that they could get American dollars, sometimes they used South African rand, but to the extent that you could find foreign currency, anything that you wanted to buy in currency really had to be in foreign currency or barter. That was really the only way that you could do it. Other times, it's official, where the government makes a decision to essentially dollarize. Anybody been to the Bahamas? Okay, so if you ever go to the Bahamas, you'll see what a currency board is. And what's a currency board? currency board is just a backed local currency on a one-to-one basis with a foreign currency. So if you go to the Bahamas, they have a local Bahamian dollar. That Bahamian dollar, though, is really a US dollar. Every dollar of Bahamian currency that's issued is backed by a US dollar, either a physical dollar or a reserve in dollars. Okay? So why? First of all, why do you want to have your own domestic currency? Well, in part because, for reasons I talked about just a couple minutes ago, you know, if you actually physically use dollars domestically, what happens when those dollars wear out over time? It becomes a problem for you, right? So, I mean, this is actually the way that you can maintain your currency while still keeping the backing of a foreign currency. Why does Bahamas do this, do you think? Well, what's Bahamas' main source of revenue? Tourism. Where's almost all that tourism from? The United States. They're linked to the United States economy, right? Does Botswana have its own strong financial system? No, right? They have no real financial system to speak of, right? Does it make sense for them to have independent monetary policy, independent interest rates, do their own open market operations? No. They realize that their economy is linked to the US economy. They're along for the ride with the US. So why don't we just make it simple, right? Just link to the dollar. This is essentially a fixed exchange rate. Right? This is a fixed exchange rate. A kind of an extreme version of a fixed exchange rate, but a fixed exchange rate. And so you can imagine in this kind of environment, what does monetary policy become? Well, it doesn't really become very much. You really don't have monetary policy. The central bank here is really about maintaining your reserve of dollars and doing what you can to make sure that you don't lose your reserve of dollars, right? And so, you know, this is kind of monetary policy focused, you know, simplified down to one thing, right? Let's keep a reserve of dollars so that we can maintain a stable money supply. And that's pretty much it. Many countries have the problem of fiscal dominance. I think I used this phrase before. Fiscal dominance meaning the Treasury relies on the central bank to pay its bills. So this is usually when there's no independence. When the central bank is not independent from the president or the legislature or the Treasury. And so as a result, politicians just see the central bank as basically a money machine. So I think I told you, we were talking about Zimbabwe here. How in the world does a country get 100% a day inflation? Fiscal dominance, right? I mean, basically, the short history of Zimbabwe was that Zimbabwe fought a horrible civil war in the late 70s, early 80s. At the end of the civil war, this situation Zimbabwe was left in was that the majority of the country is black, right? They essentially had political power, but the majority of the profitable farmable land was still held by whites. And so, you know, this situation kind of existed for a while until the 1990s, and when the government began to take land from white farmers and give it to black soldiers from the revolution. Okay, now you can kind of understand why, you know, why it might be in the public interest to redistribute land. The problem was that the land was simply redistributed by taking it from some people and giving it to others. And in this case, taking it from people who knew how to farm and giving it to people who didn't know how to farm. And so this land redistribution led to a complete economic collapse, as Zimbabwe, who is, you know, basically an agricultural country, often known as the breadbasket of Africa, farming just collapsed. The agricultural sector collapsed, the economy collapses. How then does the government pay its bills? It just starts printing up money, and there we go, right? And the reason it pays up money is because the central bank was never independent from the treasury. And so when they couldn't collect taxes, they said, well, let's just turn on the printing press. So, you know, that's also a big part of central banking in many less developed countries is, you know, central banks in many countries are really seen as a way of paying your bills. The final big challenge in a lot of less developed countries is that they just simply lack credibility. We're going to talk more about credibility on Thursday, right? But I will say that this is one of the more important keywords in modern monetary policy. Can you say something and be believed? Okay, if the chairman of the Federal Reserve comes out tomorrow and says, we're reducing inflation by 1%, how are markets going to respond to that? They will act as if inflation was just reduced by 1%. In other words, there's not a lot of difference between what the Federal Reserve says and what is treated as fact. That's credibility, okay? So in many ways, the Fed doesn't even have to do anything. It just has to say it's doing something to be believed. Now, of course, if you do that too many times, right? If you say you're going to do something and you don't do it, then you lose credibility. But, you know, when the Fed says it's committed to something, right? If the Fed says it's committed to low inflation, markets believe that because the Fed has established some credibility. The problem in many of these less developed countries is that markets really don't believe them, right? Either because of all the politics involved, because of incompetent management, because the people who work in the central bank come and go, right? And nobody knows them and nobody knows how committed they are to their word. And so credibility really increases your power. It increases the power of central banks. So what happens if you don't have any credibility? You don't really have much power, right? You don't really have much power. And so that is something that central banks worry about all the time. And even the Fed, I have to say, even the Fed worries about its credibility. Credibility is very, very important because it's very important that if you want to influence markets, you have to be believed, or you have to be believed. And so talking about this, I think, you know, kind of puts in, I think there's a couple reasons why I wanted to talk about this. One is because it kind of puts the problems of the Fed in some context, right? The Fed has some big problems, but, you know, actually the challenges are fairly minor relative to some of the challenges in some of these other countries, right? With poorer countries that have, you know, much weaker central banks. But also to kind of think about, right? these kind of help us think about how the Federal Reserve conducts its job, right? And think about how, you know, this job is different across different countries. All right, so anybody have any questions about this? All right, how about for the exam tomorrow? Are we all clear about what's going on with the exam, right? So chapters 9, 10 on banking, chapter 12 on financial crises. Let's see, chapters 13 and 14 on the Fed and monetary policy. And then any other additional readings from The Economist, or I think, I'm trying to remember if I've assigned the additional things to read in there. Did I during that period?
There one on sovereign debt.
Sovereign debt, thank you. Yeah, sovereign debt crises, right? I knew I was forgetting something. Sovereign debt crises, right? That's the other thing. So those are the big topics. Format of the exam, exactly the same. So, yeah, Rose.
How much you said last week that stuff that we learned before the exam. I was just wondering, like, if there were going to be stuff from the previous chapters, how much would it be?
Well, my questions are going to focus on that material, okay? But what we've talked about in that material builds on some things that we've talked about in the first part of class. So I'm not going to go back and ask questions specifically about things from the first part of class. I'm not going to ask you the Gordon growth equation or calculating yield to maturity or any of that kind of stuff. But there are some things, particularly, I would say, definitions and concepts that could show up again. But my purpose is, it's not showing up because I want to retest you on this stuff in the first week. It's going to be related to what we've talked about in this second part of class. Yeah.
We need a calculator for tomorrow.
Yeah, bring a calculator. Yeah, bring a calculator. Once again, we'll start at 9. You'll have till 11:30. I really think, last time that was enough time for everybody. And so, you know, I don't think this exam is going to be any longer. In some ways, it might be a little bit shorter because, as I said, I think there's kind of less calculation kind of problems. So I don't know if calculation problems are quicker to do or longer to do. I guess maybe that depends on you, but the exam should be roughly the same length as it was. And so we won't have class tomorrow afternoon. Right? We won't have class tomorrow afternoon. You guys can have the afternoon off, and then I'll send you an email. But yeah, we'll just have the usual round of readings and stuff for Thursday. Okay? Okay, well, if things come up tonight, you have questions that need to be answered, send them to me. And if not, I will see you back here at 9 a.m. Okay, have a good one.